Hello there, I'm Catherine Nicholson. This is Talking Europe on France 24. Thanks very much for joining us for the programme. Now, as people all around this continent start to see coronavirus lockdown measures eased off, thoughts are increasingly focused on what comes next. A major worry for many people is that the damage that will have been done to jobs, businesses and wider economies, both by the pandemic and by the measures being taken to halt its deadly spread. With us today to talk about the dangers and some of the potential solutions or safety nets is the man who's in charge of the European Stability Mechanism, which many people will know as the Eurozone's bailout facility. Hello, Klaus Regling. Thank you very much for joining us on the line from Munich.
Hello, and nice to join you.
I've just got a quite general economic outlook sort of first question for you. With the bigger picture, we're looking at a lot of economic damage in Europe. The Eurozone expected to see its economic output shrink by more than 7% this year. And unemployment is forecast to rise to 9.5%. Some people say that the shock will be worse, in fact, than the financial crises of the last decade. How bad do you think it is looking for European economies right now?
I think it's really bad. It's an unprecedented crisis. We have not seen anything like this during our lifetime. I think it can only be compared with the Great Depression in the 30s, so about 90 years ago. In my view, it will be clearly worse than the global financial crisis. In late 2008 and then 2009. And it's, of course, the pandemic, the medical problems, the health problems. It's a lockdown, but it's also so bad because it's a global phenomenon. So that means also our export industry suffers because it's bad everywhere, also in Asia, North and South America. It's a simultaneous crisis around the world. And that's why the numbers you mentioned, which are the forecasts of the IMF and the European Commission, are probably on the optimistic side. Many people think it could be worse than that.
Well, of course, a lot of eyes turn to the recovery, as I said, how to make up as well for all this money that's being currently poured into supporting economies and healthcare systems. Now, your institution, the European Stability Mechanism, is already involved in the recovery. A new pandemic crisis support mechanism activated on May the 15th. Just for our viewers, what's the difference between this and those bailouts that we saw the ESM preside over during the recent financial crises, which were very painful for the countries that took them on, and many would say punitive?
Yeah, let me first say, of course, I said the situation is now very bad, but there's also no doubt there will be a recovery. The question is how quickly and how strong, but there will be a recovery. And that is very much supported by what the European countries do individually. They have put a lot of money on the table with discretionary fiscal action, and fiscal deficits will go up a lot. Then the European institutions come in, and there the ESM is one of three. The other two, the European Commission and the European Investment Bank, are also beefing up their programs. And we'll probably get to that a bit later. So the ESM has to be seen as part of that broader context. It's the national governments, they are in charge firstly, and then the European institutions complement what is happening at the national level. And that's very important because we see already today that some European countries are able to do more than some others. Also, some European countries are hit more by the pandemic than others. And they do what they can to get over that. But it's now we are designing the European response coming from these European institutions, including the ESM, that they can spend money from which the countries that are most affected will benefit more. And that's important to create a level playing field, to protect the single market, to avoid divergences in the monetary union. So it's a very well organized, very broad approach. Within that broad approach, the ESM is one element. It's only one, but it's an important one because we are fully functioning and we could come in very quickly. We are ready now. We can disperse money, in particular to countries that are expected.
But you are ready now with this
And you wanted
money.
to know what?
And it would be available, if I think I'm correct, for funding healthcare costs, direct healthcare costs in countries that are affected. Is that right? This money's ring-fenced for specific needs. But no European government has applied yet at the point where we record this interview. There is a stigma, isn't there, attached to the ESM as a bailout fund that brought in this painful austerity in 5 EU states.
Yeah, well, that's what I read and hear all the time. But I think we are beyond that, because our approach now is completely different from 10 years ago for a very good reason. Because 7, 8, 9 years ago, there had to be what we call conditionality. It was unavoidable that our money was linked to policy reforms, because the countries that lost market access at the time had in place wrong policies and wrong developments for quite a while. They had lost competitiveness, therefore they had huge trade deficits, very large fiscal deficits, and it was to some extent the result of wrong policy. So those policies had to be corrected. That was the right approach at the time. Now it's the right approach to be very different, because now no government can be blamed for the problems that we all face, and all of us are hit by this pandemic. So there's no need to correct policies, and therefore the approach from the ESM rightly is completely different from 7, 8 years ago. So the markets, by the way, understand that. They know when a country draws money from the ESM, it's very cheap, basically at zero interest rate. It's very long term. It's reliable. We not withdraw capital when there's another little problem, like some investors do. So it's actually good for the country and good for private sector investors. So the stigma, I think, is a bit outdated with our new approach.
Well, if in that case it is cheap borrowing, lacking this conditionality, as you've just said, what would you say then to the likes of Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez or Italy's Giuseppe Conte, who so far have been very much against the idea of applying for this ESM funding?
Well, they are not excluding it. They are saying we don't need it at the time, which is correct, because the countries, unlike 10 years ago, have not lost market access. But it's available. I think it's very good that the euro area, the 19 governments of the euro area, agreed to design this offer from the ESM in a way that it could be made available on very short notice, on very beneficial terms when it's needed. At the moment, most countries think it's not needed, but it may happen later on, and I'm not worried about it, because if we can keep the money and don't spend it, that's also good, because we are in a way a crisis fund, and it's always good to have something in the pocket for times when it gets very difficult. But it's a good offer, and I would expect that the one or the other country will draw on it eventually.
We'll have to see, of course. Now, just looking at the bigger, longer-term recovery for Europe, the European Commission due to launch its recovery plan within the next few days, although it has been a bit delayed. We recently saw the French and German leaders come together with a joint proposal for giving 500 billion euros worth of grants to EU member states to help the regions worst hit by the virus, not just Eurozone members, I should say. This would be based on something rather groundbreaking, joint borrowing by the EU on international markets. It's been a very controversial idea. There's been a lot of resistance in your home country, Germany. Do you believe that this Franco-German plan is the right direction to take?
Yes, because this is for the recovery phase. What we talked about already is for this year. So there's a response at the national level from the European Investment Bank, from the Commission and the ESM to help right now. And that can also help to bridge the time till the next phase starts, the recovery phase. And the recovery phase will probably last 2 or 3 years, starting late this year or early next year. So it will be long. And it will be expensive again. Money will be needed.
But specifically on this idea of joint borrowing, if I could just come in, specifically, Mr. Regling, on the joint borrowing by the EU on international markets, it hasn't been done before, and it's very controversial for some member states, namely Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands and Sweden. Are you in favour of that particular idea?
Yeah, although what you said is just wrong. There has been a lot of joint borrowing. Whenever the ESM issues bonds to finance our loans, this is joint borrowing. The same happens from the European Investment Bank. And with smaller numbers, also the European Commission has been doing it for decades. So this is not new at all. It's often misunderstood. We have at the moment about 800 billion euro in European bonds circulating in the international markets. This is joint borrowing. But now for the recovery phase, it's, in my view, a very good approach, what was proposed by Germany and France. I'm in favor. So the joint borrowing is not really the new thing, but it happens to a much larger extent via the European budget. And this, according to the French-German plan, should then lead to grant financing, budgetary financing to countries that are particularly affected. And that's different because when the ESM gives a loan, we issue bonds, but we issue a loan that has to be repaid by the country.
Exactly.
Here the money will be used to finance budgetary transfers, and that is controversial. But I think it's the appropriate concept for this type of crisis in order to protect the single market and monetary union. So I'm in favor. It's clear that several countries are against it. I think the majority is in favour.
More discussions to be had, I'm sure. Thank you very much for now, Klaus Regling, Managing Director of the European Stability Mechanism. And thanks to you as well for watching. Do stay tuned for part 2 of Talking Europe.
At France 24, our goal is to follow the news around the world as it develops and keep you informed at all times.
The coronavirus pandemic is hitting us all hard, not just in France, but everywhere. We at France 24 are determined to provide you with reliable and verified information as the world confronts the biggest health crisis for a century.
Wherever we are, however best we can, we're trying our utmost to keep on bringing you the very latest news.
France 24 is on the ground, reporting from the field in English, French, Arabic and Spanish. Keep watching and reading on France24.com.
France 24, our mission is to inform you.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.